Let's give a warm round of applause for our traditional dance group. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and once again, welcome to our campus at Atma Jaya University of Indonesia. Welcome to the 6th ASEAN Event Series and Nobel Lecture Session titled Prospects for Global Financial Stability, which will be delivered by Professor Robert Fry, the 2003 Nobel laureate in economics. Today we are very proud to have our distinguished speaker, Professor Engel, here with us today. We would also like to extend our welcome to Dr. Agustinus Pastiantoko, Rector of Atma Jaya University, and all new members, Mr. Uwe Monowetz, representative of International Peace Foundation, Mr. Aswit Riyadi, Chief of Atma Jaya Foundation, and all members of Atma Jaya Foundation attending this lecture, and all honorable guests today. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Amanda, and I'm a student here at the Faculty of Economics at Atma Jaya, and it is an honor to be hosting today's event. We would like to thank our sponsors, Prudential, BCA, Mandiri, Bank Indonesia, Sinar Maslan, Bank BRI, MNC Bank, Bank Agris, Bank BRI, PT Triputra, KSAI, and Mizan. We would also like to extend our gratitude to the Association of Indonesian Economists, or ISEI, and the Financial Services Authority of the OJK. Thank you also to our media partners, Kompas TV, Tempo, and Kontan, as their support is crucial to the success of today's event. You can also watch this lecture on YouTube, streamed live, by typing in the keyword search Nobel Bridges Atma Jaya. Now, to begin today's proceedings, we would like to invite Dr. Agustinus Pastiantoko, Director of Atma Jaya University, to deliver his welcome remarks.
Distinguished speakers, Honorable Professor Robert Engels, and your Deputy Governor of Indonesia, welcome, Mr. Diaspora, Mr. Uwe Monowetz, Chairman of International Peace Foundation, honorable guests, students, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is our great pleasure to welcome you, all the participants of this special public lecture from Professor Robert Engels, Nobel laureate economics Ireland. We are very honored to be given the opportunity to host this event, and I would like to express sincere gratitude to International Peace Foundation for giving us the opportunity. Today, we will listen to Professor Engels' lectures on the prospect of the global financial stability. Risk, volatility, and instability are more and more frequent and become common in our recent world. It might be that stability become abnormal, and it could be an important challenge for peace. Facing instability, humans tend to be selfish. That is why protectionism is pervasive during the global financial crisis. International Monetary Fund warns that the economic stagnation would fuel protectionist fall. IMF warning was launched even before the US presidential election last year. As the consequence, peace, social cohesion will be an important challenge for the humanity in the future. Therefore, it is our pleasure to collaborate with International Peace Foundation, who actively promote peace with cultural and education activities, such as our event this afternoon. Our honorable guest, the very distinguished prominent economist, Prof. Engels, will enlighten us with his lectures on the futures of global financial stability and how we should deal with this situation. Atma Jaya Catholic University of Indonesia proudly hosts these lectures, and as a higher education institution, we are committed to the production of highly qualified knowledge to grow together with the nations for the betterment of the society. Last but not least, I would like to thank all sponsors, committee, and organizers of these lectures. Without them, we will not be able to be here this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Rector, for the welcome remarks. Next in order will be be an address by Mr. Uwe Morawetz, a representative of the International Peace Foundation, as the promoter of this event. For that, we now invite Mr. Uwe Morawetz to kickstart the event with the address.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome to the 6th ASEAN event. There is Bridges, Dialogues for the Planet. Bridges is facilitated by the International Foundation, Non-Political and Non-Religious Foundation, under the common patronage of 20 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. The events are hosted in cooperation with various local partners, including the country's major universities, and I would like to thank Atma Jaya University for hosting our event today. Having started in January 2017, Bridges will be continuously held in Indonesia until March, involving the participation of Nobel laureates for economics, peace, physics, chemistry, and medicine. The 6th ASEAN series of Bridges follows the series of over 600 Bridges events, which the International Peace Foundation has already hosted in many ASEAN countries since the year 2003, as an independent contribution to the Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, initiated and promoted by the United Nations General Assembly. 48 Nobel laureates, as well as 20 other keynote speakers and artists, including Dr. Hans Blix, Chucky Chan, Reverend Jesse Jackson, Vanessa May, Jesse Norman, President Romano Prodi, the late Demanika Roddick, Oliver Stone, and Dr. James Wolfenson participated in these events. In Thailand, they were presided over by Her Majesty Queen Sirikit and Her Royal Highness Princess Mahachakri Sirimphone, and reached an audience of 180,000 participants. As peace cannot be achieved instantly, but is a process which needs time, Bridges has not been organized as a single conference, but as an ongoing series of events in which Nobel laureates and international decision makers have built strong bridges with leaders in all parts of society and with the general public. With a basis for peace being education and synergies being the fruit of cooperation, the International Peace Foundation has not realized the Bridges alone, but has carried out the program together with UNESCO and with 145 other national and international institutions, including 75 major universities and schools. The multidisciplinary and pluralistic approach of Bridges in Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Singapore, and of the events now in Indonesia reflects that peace involves all parts of society. It involves awareness and social responsibility of politicians, the business community, scientists, artists, and the media. And since peace within ourselves, our families, and our environment starts in our minds and hearts, it involves every one of us. In this sense, Bridges challenges us to cross borders and to build bridges by listening and opening up to other viewpoints, by generating new thoughts, by developing innovative forms of cooperation, and by fulfilling the desire of everyone to get to know and to learn from each other. This can lead us to a world in which we will be able to understand each other and the complexities we face today in a new light. The globalized world needs broad strategies for change to secure a sustainable future for us and the next generations. So let us be inspired by the knowledge and the wisdom that Bridges continues to offer, an opportunity to get a more inclusive, interconnected, and comprehensive view of ourselves and the world in which we live in which we are able to create anew constantly through dialogues towards a culture of peace which need the participation of everyone. I thank the 2003 Nobel laureate for economics, Professor Robert Engel and his wonderful wife Marianne, who have agreed to come to Indonesia to support the events. We look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. Welcome, Professor Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Morawitz, for the address. And now, please welcome Atma Jaya Student Choir Group PSGSJ, who will perform a traditional song titled Sik Sik Si Batu Manikan. This song is originally from north of Sumatra and tells us a story about a joyful time in a hometown when family and friends gather round and dance together. We would like to extend our warmest welcome to Mr. Mirza Aditya, Senior Governor Deputy of Bank Indonesia, and we would kindly like to invite you to come up on stage and deliver your speech for today's event. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, Rector of Atma Jaya University, my friends, Bapak Dr. Prasetyo, Civitas Akademika of the Atma Jaya University, Honorable 2003 Nobel Laureate in Economics Professor Robert Engel, and also friends IPC, International Peace Foundation, and all the students and economists and friends in the business community. First of all, I would like to apologize that the governor, Bapak Agus Martowardoyo, actually he planned to come, but you cannot change the schedule of the president because it's unscheduled. The president has the rapat cabinet meeting for this afternoon, so he must attend the cabinet meeting. So please allow me to read his speech for this very important event. The topic of this event is the prospect for global financial stability. So ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you. First of all, allow me to express my sincere appreciation to Atma Jaya University for inviting me to deliver my speech in this special occasion of Nobel Lecture, which will be presented by Professor Robert Engel, world-renowned economist and 2003 Nobel laureate in economics. In my opinion, the Nobel Lecture that focuses on the prospect for global financial stability is highly relevant with current challenges and dynamics in global context. The impacts of some of these challenges and dynamics are known, while some others are not. For instance, we can predict the impact of Fed fund rate hikes and raising oil price, but this is still unknown for how Brexit and trade protectionism are going to affect our economy. In addition, there are also risks that are still not known whether they are going to materialize, let alone their impacts on the economy. In this category are geopolitical risks playing out in certain parts of the world, such as Middle East and Europe. But there is also good news from the global economy. We can expect a higher growth in 2017, stemming primarily from gains in the US and China. US economic growth is improving and as reflected in the rise of inflation and falling unemployment. Meanwhile, China economic growth is revised upward as the government plans to prioritize growth over reform in this year 2017. As a consequence, it is reasonable to expect a hike in Fed fund rate is not so distant future. We still don't know. Is it in the next March, or May, or June? We at Bank Indonesia expect that most likely the rate increase will be more likely in the second semester rather than in the first semester. But who knows? It is also predicted that in 2017, oil price to continue rising, especially after OPEC and several non-OPEC countries agreed to cut productions, while prices of precious metals and other commodities is anticipated to move in an upward trend. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good news is also heard in the Indonesian domestic economy. Macroeconomic and monetary stability remain preserved and continues on strong footing despite global uncertainties. Economic growth in 2016 arrived at 5.02, with average growth rate of 5.5% in the last 5 years. Meanwhile, Indonesia balance of payment in 2016 recorded a relatively large surplus of billion, with the current account deficit remains in healthy level at 1.8% of GDP. Strengthening performance of Indonesian economy may also be tracked by the appreciating trend of rupiah on the back of positive sentiment on domestic economic outlook, which is in line with stable macroeconomic conditions and the success of the tax amnesty program. This brings the position of Indonesia official reserve asset, foreign exchange reserve, at the end of 2016 at 116.4 billion, or equivalent to 8.8 months of import, or 8.4 months of import and servicing government external debt, which is well above in the international standard of 3 months. Maybe to elaborate, during the global financial crisis, Indonesia foreign exchange reserve was around $55 billion. It's around 2008, 2009. And then during the quantitative easing of the US, a lot of capital inflows came to emerging markets, including Indonesia. Foreign exchange reserve increased to around $124 billion. And then started the European crisis, the Greece crisis in 2011, 2012. Capital outflow happened in emerging markets, including in Indonesia. At that time, foreign exchange reserve started to come down. And then the toughest period was during the taper tantrum of 2013, when the US Fed announced that US Fed are ready to increase the rate. But the rate increase not happening for another 2 years. So heavy volatility happened in emerging market, including in Indonesia. At that time, some people call Indonesia is one of the fragile five. We don't want to be called as a fragile five. So what happened? In 2013, mid of 2013, we make a disciplinary effort in our macro management. From Indonesia, we increased rate a couple of times. We tightened the macro potential, loan to value ratio. The government cut subsidies for energy. During that time, current account deficit in the second quarter of 2013 was above 4% of GDP. After we did a disciplinary effort, in macro management, in 2014, it started to show the result. Current account deficit started to come down. And then foreign exchange reserve, and at the lowest during the taper tantrum was $92 billion. The foreign exchange reserve started to increase. Capital flows started to come back to Indonesia. Inflation for the overall 2016 was maintained within the target corridor of the low level at 3.02%. Again, to elaborate, during 2013-2014, when the government reduced the subsidy, inflation increased to 8.4%, 2013-2014. But in 2015, inflation came back to 3.3%, and 2016 only 3.0%. In our current conditions, improved significantly to 1.8% of GDP. The subsidy to total government expenditure, there was a period when subsidy to total expenditure was around 27 to 28% of total expenditure. That was during 2008 and also in 2010. Now, the subsidy to total expenditure last year was only 10%. This year is less than 10%. It's around 7 to 8% of total expenditure. The level of inflation is the lowest inflation in the last 5 years. Such low inflation was achieved as a core inflation was managed to remain under control and administered price of inflation was minimal, despite rising volatile food inflations. Global challenges and dynamics have also affected financial system stability. Nevertheless, Indonesian financial system remains stable, supported by resilient banking industry. As of December 2016, the capital adequacy ratio was recorded at 22.7% and the liquidity ratio at 20.9%. Meanwhile, non-performing loans were recorded 2.9% gross or 1.1% net. Yes, because commodity price collapse, because China economy decline, there is impact to the commodity price, there is impact to Indonesian economy, there is impact to the MPL. The MPL prior to the taper tantrum, prior to the China economy downturn was only 1.5%. Now MPL is around 2.9, 3 or around 3%. But Indonesia banking capital adequacy ratio is close to 23%. And Indonesia provisioning coverage ratio against NPL is above 100%. Our accomplishment of monetary and financial system stability in Indonesia is not an overnight undertaking. Rather, it is a process of building integrated, consistent, and credible policy over a medium to longer term horizons. It is believed that macroeconomic stability, including price stability and financial stability, are prerequisite for sustainable economic growth. High inflation, volatile price, and less resilient financial system are often associated with risk and uncertainty that in turn reduces efficiency and productivity. Uncertainty also weakens firms and consumer confidence, limit risk-taking activities, and hamper investment, as investors tend to defer actions. We all know that investment and productivity are essential for promoting long-term growth. Thus, it is paramount to achieve price stability while maintaining financial stability. Bank Indonesia, in exercising its mandate to achieve and maintain the stability of the rupiah, sets monetary and macro-prudential policy that are integrated and synergized into a policy mix. In monetary policy area, Bank Indonesia, among others, has relaxed its monetary policy by stressing policy rate by 150 basis points and lowering reserve requirement by 150 basis points. So after we increased interest rate and tightened monetary situation in 2013, but after we able to control the current account deficit, the inflations, and then the government also able to control the budget deficit, then we had room to start cutting interest rate in 2016 and also relaxing the loan to value ratio and also relaxing the primary reserve requirement. Within a macro-prudential policy, Bank Indonesia has issued several policies that include loan to value ratio, counter-cyclical capital buffer, loan to funding ratio, and also medium and small micro enterprise loan allocation policy. Bank Indonesia also aligned its crisis management protocol with the law on financial system crisis prevention and mitigation, which is enacted on April 15, 2016. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, aside from setting credible policy, Bank Indonesia performed critical top-down stress testing as part of the systemic risk assessment. The stress testing takes into account the effect of the extreme but possible macroeconomic events and their impact on the banking system. Bank Indonesia also continuously align its policy and regulations, international best practices and standards, and improving its assessment practices, engaging in the most current research and actively involved in various international forums. Mutual relationship with the academia through discussion and joint research are also maintained. Nevertheless, coordination and collaboration are still based with other institutions and regulators in financial sectors, Ministry of Finance, with OJK, Indonesia FSA, Indonesia Insurance Corporations, under the framework of Financial System Stability Committee. We also maintain a regular communication and coordinations with the governments in relation to the managing the current account deficit, managing the budget balance, and also very important is to control inflations. In attending here is Iskandar from Authority Minister of the Economic Office. This is all to ensure that all aspects pertaining development and dynamics in the financial sectors are carefully observed, assessed, and evaluated by members of the committee according to their respective function and authority to determine the status of financial system, whether it is normal, cautious, alert, or assumed crisis condition. Global economy on one hand is expected to be better in 2017 with higher global growth and improving global commodity price. We may also see low interest rate environment with better banks balance sheet, which means more room for improved credit growth. On the other hand, economic challenges remain ahead. We need to remain vigilant of the risk of recurrent pressure on exchange rate. Transmission of monetary policy will also need to be accelerated, as now there seems to be rigidity in loan rates and credit growth. Although economy in 2017 seems to be in better shape, we must be cautious with global and domestic risks. On global financial market, the risk among others stem from the US government policy directions and frequency of further interest rate hikes. On the domestic front, the risk associated with the adjustment of administered price as the government continues to reform energy subsidies. Bank Indonesia projected economic growth in 2017 in the range of 5 to 5.4%, driven by exports, investment, as financing increases growth from both bank loans and non-bank financing. Stable household consumption is also predicted, and inflation will be within target of 4 plus minus 1%. The current account deficit remained below 2.5% of GDP. To end my speech today, I would like to convey and reiterate Bank Indonesia commitment as a central bank to maintaining macroeconomic and financial system stability, while giving sufficient space for economic growth momentum. We have no reason not to be optimistic, but we should also remain cautious. This is the job of central bank, to remain cautious. We should also remain cautious of the dynamics within the global and domestic economic challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the insightful speech, Pak Mirza, and thank you for joining us today on behalf of the Central Bank. We would also like to extend our warmest welcome to Ibu Mari Elka Pangestu, former Minister of Tourism and Creative Economy. Thank you for joining us today. Now, without further ado, it is time for the lecture we have all been waiting for. Allow me to invite and briefly introduce our moderator for today's session, Dr. Martin Panggabean, obtained his PhD in 1993 from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He had served as Chief Economist at NIB from 1999 to 2010 and was Head of Risk Management of Bank Mega from 2010 to 2016. He is currently a faculty member here in Atma Jaya School of Business and Economics, and he helped establish a new master's program in applied economics with a concentration in risk management. Please welcome Dr. Martin Panggabean.
Thank you, Marta. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to moderate this session. First, I have to tell you, it feels strange to stand here introducing somebody that everybody knows. But for those in this room who do need information, please allow me to briefly introduce Professor Engel and his recent works. Professor Engel was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2003 for his works on, among others, co-integration and art. Today, both co-integration and art have become essential tools and standard for any modern financial economist must know. Now, an abbreviated version of Professor Engel's CV is on the slide, and I just need to point out that Professor Engel obtained his PhD at the age of 27 and taught for several years at MIT before spending more than 25 years at University of California, San Diego. This year, he will turn 75 years old, but he remains very, very active. You can see here, there's a gap here, but he has been very busy writing all of his stuff. Now, what has he done since then? 6 years after his Nobel Prize, in 2009, Professor Engel founded the Volatility Institute. The institute produced many outputs, but one thing captured my attention immediately: a statistical model that ranks financial institutions in terms of their impact to systemic risk. Based on this model, Professor Engel made thought-provoking assessment about banks in China and Europe, which you can see on the slide. So is that I worried a lot about the Chinese bank. China is loaded with debt. This assessment has direct implications on global financial stability. Later on, hopefully, you will see his assessment on Indonesia in his slides. This goes to show Professor Engel's leadership on the subject of financial stability. Now, Professor Engel thought leadership on financial stability is a well-established fact. The graph shows that when times are rough, as in 2008-2010, people search for answers in Professor Engel's academic work. As you can see, the mountain is spiked up there. So today, Professor Engel will share with us his thought on the prospect of global financial stability. The financial stability prospect is currently overshadowed by continuing uncertainty in Greece, the issue of Brexit, the future of EU, the role of China, as well as the new administration in the US. On the surface, times are not as rough now as it was in 2008-2010. But is it true like that? Are we truly leaving the 2008-2010 financial crisis behind? We hope that Professor Engel's wealth of knowledge and his presentation today can become a source of illumination, inspiration for us as we prepare for the uncertain future. Distinguished guests, as a courtesy to the audience and to the speaker, I would like to remind you to switch your cellular phone to silent mode. Professor Engel, may we request 45 minutes of your time to deliver your lecture. We will provide additional time for Q&A session. Some people already asked because they read your paper and they really want to ask a specific question about your. I'm telling you, it's not going to be an easy question for you. So without further delay, I would like to invite Professor Engel to come to the stage. Please give applause to welcome Professor Engel.
With this microphone, or I can speak with this microphone. That was easy. Need to make sure this one's off, otherwise. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Rector of Atma Jaya University, its Deputy Governor of the Bank of Indonesia. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to be with you. Looks like a great audience out here of faculty and students, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you what I call the prospects for global financial stability. We can all agree that financial stability is an important goal for the global economy, but maybe we don't all agree exactly what that means. I've shown you in this first picture a lake, which is perfectly calm. You look out on this lake, you see white clouds, still water. The question is, what's going to happen to this lake in the future? Is it going to have turbulence? Is it going to have waves? Are these waves going to be serious and make it difficult for us to pass through the lake? Next. Do I have the clicker? There we go. So, I showed you the lake. That's sort of symbolic. Now let's take a look at the world. If you go to my website, which is up here, vlab.stern.nyu.edu, and those of you with a phone that's connected could do this at this moment, you will see a map of the world. Now this map of the world is color-coded depending on what we forecast the volatility to be. This actually is from a few days ago, and we forecast that the volatility would be low in almost all countries of the world. The green means that the volatility is low relative to its past expectations. But this map gets updated every day. And so we have a continual forecast of the volatility of all these countries around the world. And so it's interesting to speculate why the volatility is so low in so many countries when there are so many potential problems that we foresee and that the Deputy Governor discussed, and I think we'll all foresee on the horizon. And that's kind of what we want to talk about today. How do we go from these maps, which have basically the current view, which is pretty low volatility and in the short run, to a longer horizon picture of what. So, what stability? Do we mean that there is no risk? Well, we don't mean that there is no risk. Financial markets don't operate if there's no risk. If there's no risk and you invest in a stock, it means you know what its value is going to be in the future. If we knew what the value of a stock was going to be in the future, we would all buy the same stock that was going up and we wouldn't buy any of the others. That's obviously not going to work. If we had no risk, firms would have no incentive to put new products on the market, to invest in new technologies. There would be no reason for productivity growth. Financial markets depend on risk. We need to have risk in financial markets. So, what are we looking at when we talk about financial stability? Well, let me see if I can explain it with a picture. Here is a picture. This is a picture of risk-taking. You have a chimpanzee in the top of a very tall tree. He is trying to catch insects to eat. He's reaching out as far as he can to catch as many as he can. He's taking a lot of risk. The further he reaches, the more he's likely to catch, and the better off he is, unless he takes too much. This is a picture of risk and return as we classically think of it. You take more risk, you get more return. You can't get more return without taking some risk. This is the way financial markets are designed to work, that if you think there is a sure thing, it's probably not a sure thing. You can only take, it's always a risk associated with improved returns. So, I'd like to contrast that with systemic risk. And systemic risk is a new, relatively new risk that we now are convinced is an important component of financial crises. Certainly the most recent ones in the West, but also probably the Asian currency crisis that you all experienced here in the 90s. What's the difference? Let me show you another picture. In fact, this looks like the same picture, but I'm going to give you one new piece of information. This chimpanzee in the top of the tree is actually the last male chimpanzee. If he dies, it's the end of the race. So the girls, or women, or mothers, who run this chimpanzee community have a great deal at stake when he is reaching out for his insects. If he takes risk, everybody takes a risk. And this is the difference between ordinary risk-taking and systemic risk-taking. When firms, financial institutions, banks take risks that expose the rest of us to the risk as well, we call it systemic risk. So what does the government do in this case? Well, the government can hire workers to stand under the tree and hold a tarp. The tarp is in fact the name we gave in the US to the bailout bill during the financial crisis. But you probably recognize that having somebody under the tree is only going to encourage this young man to take even more risk. We might instead tie him to a tree to the branch with a very short rope. But then it might be clear that he will not be able to feed himself and might starve to death. That's not the goal either. The goal is to prevent his taking excessive risk. And the question is, how do you do that? And I think the answer that we have chosen in most economies is regulation. And this is what we should talk about. How do we avoid getting into the situation where we have to worry about him in the top of the tree? So regulation is designed to reduce systemic risk. When the failure of an institution to meet its obligations has serious consequences for the real economy, we say that's systemic risk. And we probably observe that the failure of one institution will be much more dangerous if the rest of the sector is weak. It means that there's nobody who's going to pick up the pieces and provide the services. The goal of regulation is therefore to ensure that financial institutions have sufficient capital so they can not only survive a financial crisis, but continue to provide services, intermediation services for the real economy. So therefore, good regulation is prevention, not rescue. But we have to be cautious that we're preventing the next crisis, not the last crisis. Right? Okay. So, what does it mean to say that banks have a capital cushion? Well, I think banks are a lot like people in this. People put aside savings in case they lose a job or in case they have extraordinary expenses like medical expenses or some special need. If you've got enough savings, then you will survive these bad events without too much stress. For banks, we deposit money in banks, and banks take this money and lend it out to companies who are growing and producing output and can pay back the loans. But if these loans that the banks make to companies are not successful, then what's going to happen? Well, the bank will not have the capital available to pay off the depositors ourselves if we should ask for the money. And in addition, especially if there is no capital cushion, no extra capital available. So the capital ratios that the banks hold are in fact the capital cushion that the banks need to hold to protect themselves against downturns in the market. And we're going to measure this capital cushion for banks around the world to see whether they are well capitalized. What we're going to measure is something that we call S-risk. And S-risk stands for systemic risk, and it's the answer to this deceptively simple question. How much capital would a financial institution need to raise in order to function normally if we have another financial crisis? It's a measure of capital shortfall, and it tells you basically how much capital would this bank need to raise if things turn down the way they did in the last financial crisis. If you have to raise capital, you can do it by selling assets or by selling shares of stock. There are a variety of ways banks can raise capital. All of these are difficult to do in the middle of a financial crisis. And therefore, in the middle of a financial crisis, if you have to raise capital, the most likely place to raise it is from the government, from taxpayers. And so we call it systemic risk because this is capital that's going to be asked for by the banking sector from the rest of us. We may or may not give this capital. We might let the banks fail. But if the banks fail, this has effects on the real economy that might be quite disastrous. And that's the reason why regulators in governments often will bail out the banks when a crisis comes. But the question is, can we prevent this dilemma from happening? And that's the role of regulation. So I could spend a lot of time talking about exactly how we do that. I give a graduate course in financial econometrics, but I don't think any of you have signed up for this class. And I think maybe I will just try to tell you kind of briefly how it works, rather than give you any details. The idea is simply that what we think a firm should have in order to survive a financial crisis is a capital ratio of equity to assets that is not too low. We actually are using a percentage as 8% for most of what I show you here. The hard question here is, how do we estimate, if we have a financial crisis, what the market cap of a financial firm is going to be? And the way we do that is what's called a beta in finance. It's when the stock market goes down as a whole by, say, 10%, how much does the stock of this company go down? If the beta is 1, it goes down by 10% as well. If the beta is 2, it goes down approximately by 20%. And so the question is, how risky are these banks as measured by their betas? We're going to estimate beta in a fairly sophisticated way using allowing volatilities and correlations to change over time, using methods derived basically from the work that I did for the Nobel Prize. And so actually the beta changes every day in these models, and we can calculate the expected capital shortfall for each firm over time. And we consider the stress in each case to be that the global equity market declines by 40% over the next 6 months. And so we want to know, is that stress going to require this institution to raise capital? Because if it does, we think that's a contributor to systemic risk. Okay, so let me skip through a few of these slides, which basically talk about sort of how we do this. We're going to use accounting data for debt and for the liabilities of banks, and market data for the equity of a bank. And let's see. Which one of these things? There we go. So this formula basically is focused on a couple of features of a financial institution. The most important one is the size. The second one is the leverage, the debt-to-equity ratio. And the third feature, which is important, is the risk as measured by this beta. So here's an example of the beta. This is for Bank of America, and what you see is that the beta, here's 1, which is a 1-for-1 movement in equity compared to the world stock market. And you see, on average, Bank of America was kind of 1. But in 2008, 2009, it shot up to maybe 3, because the financial crisis was really focused very heavily on the mortgage market, and particularly the subprime part of the mortgage market. And Bank of America was a big player in that market, and consequently, when the market started to go down, Bank of America fell like a stone. And that's exactly what we see here. Goldman Sachs, on the other hand, was more risky on average, but didn't have this big spike in 2008. Mitsubishi didn't show much of a spike at all, just a very temporary one in 2008, although in the recent period, its beta has gone up. BNP Paribas, the giant French bank, showed no effect of the beta in 2008 and 2009, but it went up dramatically during the European sovereign debt crisis because BNP was heavily invested in sovereign debt from the peripheral European countries. Italy and Greece and Spain and Portugal and Ireland were heavily a big part of their portfolio, and that was also a big part of the collapse of the market. Deutsche Bank, you see, did respond to the European sovereign debt crisis, and they also responded to the Justice Department leveled against them, which looked like it was going to be so big that it would bankrupt Deutsche Bank. They survived that, negotiated a settlement, and then we've had this increase back at the end, so that the beta for Deutsche Bank is still around 2, quite high. If you look at Barclays, you see the U.S. led mortgage-backed financial crisis, the European crisis, and then what is this? What do we see for that last spike? That's Brexit. We see a big effect from Brexit on the Barclays Bank. The beta goes up maybe to 3.5 there. So that says that the risk that Barclays faced went up dramatically after Brexit and came back down again. If you look at the Chinese banks, here's China Construction Bank. The beta doesn't move very much. It's around 1. If you look at Agricultural Bank, which is, I think, the next slide here, it's actually only 0.6, so it's substantially less than 1. The Chinese banks are large, but their betas are not very big. So we're now ready to calculate these numbers. What is systemic risk and where is it? Every time I look at this picture, I wonder how the sculptor was able to make this sculpture that doesn't fall down. These are giant steel plates that are sticking up in the air without any support. And it always makes me nervous to look at this picture. So I think of this as a picture of risk. So if you look at the world economy as a whole, what would it cost to recapitalize all the financial institutions in the world? Should we have to? Should we have another financial crisis? The answer to that question is that at the end of January 2017, it would be about $3 trillion. $3 trillion is a big number. Not if it were in rupiah, of course, but in dollars it's a big number, but it's not an astronomical number. It is approximately equal to the foreign exchange reserves of China. So if you like to think about it this way, China could potentially recapitalize all the financial institutions in the world should they get into trouble, should we have another financial crisis. It's lower than it was during either the European or the US-led financial crises, but it's not nearly as low as it was before those crises. So it looks like there's a lot of work still to be done in recapitalizing the banking structure. Where is the risk? The country with the biggest risk is China, followed by Japan, France, UK, US, Germany, Italy, Canada, Spain, and so forth. If you want to measure it relative to GDP, it might be a little more useful, and now France is on top. So the big French banks are undercapitalized, and if France as a country had to recapitalize them themselves, it looks to us like it would cost 14% of GDP to do that. That is very painful. Followed by Japan, UK, Switzerland, Spain, Canada, Greece, Italy, Korea. So you see the European countries are prominently featured in this top echelon of S-risk as percentage of GDP. If you look at the US, we see a fairly optimistic story. We put in a new regulatory apparatus, the Dodd-Frank regulation, after the financial crisis, and some combination of that and the banking sector's willingness to perform has led to a very substantial reduction in the undercapitalization of the US financial firms. Citigroup and Bank of America are at the top, but then we have actually a couple of insurance companies, one of which is a sponsor here. Thank you, Prudential. You know, for a long time we were sponsored by Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank was the top systemic risk bank. And I used to like to say, the fact that your Deutsche Bank is the most systemically important bank means it's the one that would be most dangerous if it fails. It's a very important bank. If it were to fail, it would be disaster. And so, big is, you know, if Prudential were to fail, it would be bad for the economy, and that's a tribute to Prudential, but it also means it's taking a lot of risk, in our opinion. So that's the US story. What's the European story? The European story is it's come down some, certainly since the European crisis, but it's nowhere near where it was back in 2006, 2007, before it started. There's a lot of work to be done in recapitalizing the European banks. I think that the regulatory regime of the ECB has not been as effective as I had thought it would be, but they're still working on it. How about emerging markets? This is an even more pessimistic story. What you see for emerging markets is actually the recovery after the financial crisis was good, but it's just been increasing since. This is emerging markets except for China. China is not in this universe. And as you can probably see, the last number on here is something like 250 billion. So that is a challenge, I think. What about China itself? Oops. If you look at China itself, you see an even more pessimistic picture. This is increasing very rapidly. It's increasing and now is about 700 billion, which is approximately what the peak was in the US when we had the subprime financial crisis. Maybe it's just a little bit more. So it looks like, for one thing, the level is very high, and for a second thing, the direction is very worrying. And this is what sometimes people call the Chinese debt problem, that there is so much debt in China, much of it is owned by the banks. The banks appear to be highly undercapitalized because the debt is not viewed as valuable as the accounting value of this debt, and consequently the banks look like they need capital. Here are the distribution of course, the Chinese banks, but you know, the largest Chinese banks are at the top. So I talk about this result often in China, and the reaction I get is, first of all, this model doesn't apply to China, but second of all, they already know this and are just surprised that I do. So, how does it apply to China? Well, Chinese banks are state-owned. They are not going to fail because they will be recapitalized if necessary. And so, these banks are not only too big to fail, but they are guaranteed not to fail. But that is actually the problem, because if there is no possibility to fail, then there's no reason why they have to reduce their risks. Their risks are not risks of the bankers, they're risks of the taxpayers, of the rest of the economy. They will need to be bailed out by the Chinese government, and that is somebody else's problem. Government guarantees distort risk-taking, regulatory incentives lead out to allocation into non-productive state-owned enterprises and local governments. Shadow banking is an important contributor to the Chinese banking sector, but it is really not investing in productive enterprises. It's investing primarily in real estate and stock market margin supply. But the fact is, the sovereign has plenty of capacity to recapitalize the banks and does so when needed, and therefore, in my view, we're not going to have a collapse like we did after Lehman Brothers. We're much more likely to see stagnation as the outcome in China. That the banking system is not doing a good job of taking deposits and allocating to the growing companies. They're allocating them to the riskless state-owned enterprises, which will potentially become risky if the government starts to allow defaults, and is therefore starting the growing part of the Chinese economy. Okay, how about ASEAN? Well, you know, this is not a pretty picture, but it's not as bad as emerging markets. And if we look at the distribution of risk in ASEAN countries today, you see Singapore is the top, Malaysia second, Vietnam, Thailand, and here's Indonesia with hardly any systemic risk. So Indonesian banks look well capitalized by this measure. So that's good news, right? But it's good news which has sort of a bad news side to it. It means that the Indonesian banks have a very substantial capital cushion. They're very safe. But maybe they're too safe. Are they too cautious? Are they failing to make the loans that are needed to stimulate the Indonesian economy? I think this is a discussion that I've had with quite a few people since I've been in Indonesia, and I think there's a view that, yes, there is a possibility that the banks could stimulate the economy better than they do, that they could increase the lending to the young startups that are doing such good work, and and will hire more Indonesian workers and propel the economy into the next generation. But maybe you like having a lot of safety in the banking system. But I think that this is a debate which should be handled and come forward because it's one of the key potential policy change that could actually be quite stimulative to the Indonesian economy. So, oh yes, so here's our list of Indonesian financial institutions, and there are, that little red dot is associated with these top three. There are only three that have positive S-risk. All the rest have negative, which means that in the middle of a financial crisis, they would not only not need to raise capital, they would have surplus capital. And if they have surplus capital, then they could lend it. And if you look carefully at this list, you'll see that the biggest state-owned banks are right down at the bottom here. They're the most overcapitalized banks. And I think that's another way of thinking about whether there is some opportunity for expanding the lending by the banking system. Okay, so I'd like to step back from Indonesia now and look at the world as a whole. Again, we started with the world as a whole. I want to talk about how the world is interconnected. And I'm going to show you the volatility map again. But I'm going to show it to you as of June 8th. And what you see is that in early June, it was still all green. Now I'm going to show it to you a couple of weeks later, after the Brexit vote. And what you see is the world has turned red. Volatility has gone up. For most countries in the world, there are about 20 countries in Europe that all have turned red. The US has turned red. Canada, a lot of Latin America is going orange. Australia, New Zealand. Not Indonesia. I guess you weren't too worried about Brexit. It seems kind of far away, doesn't it? But I don't know why Japan and Australia, well, I guess Australia is part of the Commonwealth. Maybe that's the reason. In any case, you also notice that Russia and China and India don't do much. All right, so what happens next? Well, by mid-July, some of the red has turned to orange, but there's still a lot of volatility. However, by the end of the summer, end of August, we're in low volatility space again. So let's do one more experiment like this. Let's look at November 8th. So this is the day we all went to the polls in the US. And to our surprise, elected Donald Trump as our next president. To my surprise, but actually I think it's pretty much everybody's surprise, including Donald Trump. So what happens next? Well, by November 14th, a couple days later, we see a lot of red on this map. But it's not the same pattern as we saw after Brexit. We see, first of all, Mexico, bright red. They didn't want the wall. And then we see Latin America is pretty much all either red or orange. Australia and Southeast Asia is pretty much all red now. We've got the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, India, and Japan here all having a high volatility in response to the Trump election. This is because, as I've heard from so many people, there's a lot of worry about what President Trump is actually going to do and what's the impact of that on our global system. We immediately saw that he was ready to cancel, that he wanted and did cancel the TPP trade agreement, But there's a lot of other stuff that he's talking about doing, and it is worrying people in Indonesia, it's worrying people in the US. So, what is the future of globalization? Well, I hope I have good binoculars, because it's a tough question. But let me give you what I think. I expect we will see, and we have seen, a move to reduce immigration into the U.S. The U.S. will negotiate and renegotiate trade policies. The U.S. will threaten to put tariffs on imports. All these things are basically anti-globalization policies. But within the U.S., I think there's going to be increasing opposition to these policies. First of all, we've seen opposition already by the judiciary that's made some of his immigration bans unenforceable. Second of all, we're expecting to see a resistance by the Republican Congress that's always been a member of the, basically believe in free trade, and I think that they're not going to be happy with putting tariffs on imports. And thirdly, the business community. I've already seen ads and so forth talking about the big retail chains that have outsourced their manufacturing and expect to be able to bring things in without paying duty on them. So I think there is going to be a rising opposition to the Trump policies, which may make them not implementable or may make them more subtle in their impact. The stock market, however, keeps hitting new highs. The stock market in the U.S. is quite enthusiastic about the Trump agenda, it seems to me. And so the question is, how can the business community be opposed to it and the stock market be in favor of it? Well, I think it's a different part of the Trump agenda that the stock market likes. He likes the idea of he is proposing reducing bank regulation, dismantling some of the Dodd-Frank bill. I think that there are parts of it that could be reduced without risk to the banking sector. I think he wants to do more than that, which I think might make the banks happy, but I don't think it's actually good thing for the long-term risk in the U.S. economy. Secondly, he wants to reduce corporate taxes and repatriate dollars that are earned abroad. The business community loves the idea of a lower corporate tax rate, and probably if it's structured well, they would be happy with the repatriation as well. So I think that this makes sense to business community. He talked during the campaign about plans for infrastructure investment, and the business community would like that, the stock market would like that. So far, the only infrastructure he's mentioned and done anything about is the wall and a pipeline from Canada to Louisiana for Canadian oil to go across the United States. Neither of these strike me as sensible infrastructure policies. So I think his policies on immigration and tariffs are going to be unpopular with business. We have to wait and see what really is going to happen with these Trump policies. I don't think that there's any guarantee that he's going to be able to implement the policies the way he conceives of them, and possibly the compromises will be not so bad. So, what about growth? Growth is the key to an awful lot of economic policy that we all are trying to do, and growth is the way banks can improve their balance sheets. It's the way governments can reduce poverty and increase employment. It produces basically a lot of benefits for economies all over the world. And the global economy has been pretty stagnant over the last several years. And you see evidence that it's picking up, and perhaps that's true. The U.S. is sort of picking up, but let's talk a little bit about where the growth is and where it isn't and what we might do about it. In my view, monetary policy has done as much as it can possibly do. When we lower interest rates to zero, and then we do quantitative easing to try to lower long-term interest rates, you can't force people to borrow just by making interest rates zero. Businesses only are going to borrow if they see opportunities. So I think we need to make these opportunities more available to businesses in order to get them to invest, and that's the way we are going to get the growth engine moving again. So how do we do that? My view is we should do something which I call responsible fiscal policy. Fiscal policy means government expenditures on things. And so what I think we should be looking for are expenditures that the government can do that will increase growth, and in particular ones that can increase the marginal product of capital. If you can increase the marginal product of capital, then that will make businesses more willing to invest. For a country like Indonesia, it will make foreign businesses more willing to put plant and equipment into Indonesia and hire jobs. So what would these look like? Well, I think that the most attractive suggestions are infrastructure investment and education investment. Infrastructure makes business more profitable because the roads are better, the internet is better, electricity functions regularly, the water is better. It makes life better for everybody, including new businesses. Education makes workers more productive. It makes them better citizens. It's something I think that everybody in this room probably believes in, and it's great to see so many of you here today. And I think education is really where the future is for not only Indonesia, but for the whole world. So this is, I think, all good. China actually has followed a policy pretty much like this, but now it has so much debt, it has to figure out how to solve the debt crisis. And that's what they're struggling over. So I'd like to close with a thought that this is not the first time we've been here. During the 30s, we had a very serious recession, depression, we call it. Interest rates were lowered to zero at that point as well, and Keynes, the most famous economist of the day, called this the liquidity trap. And I don't see why we don't call it the liquidity trap today. So what did we do instead? We did fiscal policy, we did job policy, we did a whole bunch of things, building roads, building schools, building universities with workers who were out of a job. This kind of fiscal policy was quite effective, pulled the U.S. out of recession, but in 1936 and 1937, we stopped. We felt it was costing too much, the deficit was going up, we raised taxes, and lo and behold, the economy slipped back into the depression again. The only thing that really pulled the U.S. economy out of the Great Depression was World War II. So this makes me think hard about what are the solutions we want to think about. Do we want to think about World War III as a solution to getting growth? I don't think so. That would be such a horrible outcome. So that's the challenge, I think. We have a challenge. What can we do to stimulate the economies without them going to war? We see lots of warlike discussion by big countries and small countries. I think militarism is on the rise. Protectionism is on the rise. Protectionism is the first step toward believing that you can survive without somebody else, without trading partners. Globalization basically prevents wars, in my opinion, because it means we're all interconnected. We're benefiting each other through trade. If globalization falls apart, it makes war more likely. So, my message to you, and the reason I'm here, and the reason I'm representing the International Peace Foundation, and I'm very happy to do this, is because I think we need a very strong alternative to going to war. And I think if we phrase it that way, what is the alternative to going to war? All this stuff becomes easy. You say it's hard to do these things, but compared to going to war, it's easy. And that's what we should think about. Responsible fiscal policy, building infrastructure and education. How can these be bad policies? These are automatically going to be benefits to our citizens and to the future. So I'd like to close by inviting you all to join with the global economy and make Indonesia a big part of the global economy, and we can all work for peace and globalization together. And I think that I'm hopeful that the U.S. will join in too, but you're going to have to maybe take some steps without the U.S. initially until we can get a change in regime. So these are two of my grandsons looking out over the same lake and wondering what's in their future. Is it a war, or do we have an alternative to war that's going to actually stimulate the economy and make a better life for all of us? So that challenge, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Engel. It's for me, the last part is very interesting in a sense that we have so much opportunity, but we need to work on the alternative to war. And it's quite scary to see everything about war and things like that. So it's a very disturbing, but I think it's a message that we need to keep in mind as we continue our progress and as we leave this hall. We're going to have about 30 to 40 minutes of Q&A. I know lots of people want to ask questions. I'm thinking about dividing it into 4 sessions. The first session would be for distinguished guests sitting on the first row. Second one would be to the younger generations, our students from Atma Jaya. The third one would be for everybody else, and the fourth one would be for our media and journalist partners. So, Professor, you may have a seat in one of these as we take some of the questions. First session would be for our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, who want to raise questions. Just make it a short question, one simple question, so that we can have more questions for Professor Engel to answer. Anybody who wants to start? Kumari? Please, one of the microphone.
Thank you very much, Professor Engel, for a very enlightening speech that makes us all think. I just had a quick question on your recommendation about the future, how we should move forward. You said, of course, we don't want World War III, but you said monetary policy is limited, fiscal policy is the answer, education and infrastructure. I wondered what you would say about structural reforms as well, because like in Indonesia, we face a similar question, but we have constraint on fiscal policy. So how about structural reforms?
I think structural reforms are always valuable in some respects are cheap, because they don't actually necessarily cost money. They just would be a change in rules. But if they really were that easy to do, then probably you already would have done them. So I'm totally in favor of structural reforms. And I think that if you sit back and you think about what it is that could make the Indonesian economy operate more efficiently, you can probably think of, lots of things. And I think there's no reason why that shouldn't be done at the same time as anything else that I'm talking about on this list. So these would be reforms in labor markets. There would be reforms in poverty provision, medical provision, maybe social safety nets. There are lots of kinds of structural reforms that would be very profitable. It might also be reducing reliance on state-owned enterprises, at least in China. I think that would be an important structural reform, which they're not really ready to do, but perhaps Indonesia would be. So I don't know whether you have anything particularly in mind, but I put it on the slide and I didn't mention it. I realized that, but it was mostly because I thought that the other two investment characters were expensive and yet would be worth it.
Okay, thank you, Bu Mari. Okay, if there is no other from the first row, I would like to invite our Atma Jaya students. Please raise your hand. Okay, Andrew there. Please, Andrew, and I don't got your name. And Andrew is right in the back. Okay, yeah, so 3 questions. So we'll go one by one, Andrew.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Professor Engel. First of all, I want to ask, as we may know, the connection and linkage between countries and advanced and emerging increase because of the liberalization and globalization. And as we may know too, liberalization is made to increase the growth of the countries. But we have seen so far the crisis, Asia crisis in the 90s and the global crisis in 2008 is happened because of the globalization and liberalization. Professor Engel, I want to ask your opinion about the financial stabilization in terms of the liberalization and globalization.
Okay, I don't think that globalization is a cause of the financial crisis. And when you say liberalization, are you talking about like trade liberalization and so forth? And I don't see that as being a cause either. What I think happened in the financial crisis in the US, I think it also happened in the European financial crisis, and it's why I'm concerned about China, is the banking sector was weak. And if the banking sector fails and has has defaults and stops providing the kinds of services that are needed by the real economy, then the whole real economy stops functioning very well. This is what happened. This also happened in the 30s, and so I think it's a very real issue. But I don't think it's caused by globalization or trade liberalization. It's that the banks don't hold sufficient capital cushions to be prepared for downturns.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you for the chance. Good afternoon, Professor Hengel. I want to ask about strengthen the regulation and supervision and risk of the banking sector from the Basel III agreement. I want to ask about how also financial supervisory around the world should integrate it to strengthen and reduce impact from transparency, especially for the protectionism. Thank you. Tergantung kan Basel Act 3 itu bilang bahwa kita harus memperkuat regulasi dan supervisi untuk mengurangi risiko di sektor perbankan. Bagaimana caranya kita kan di Indonesia itu ada dua pengawas keuangan yaitu BI dan OJK. Itu bagaimana caranya agar BI dan OJK itu saling terintegrasi sehingga dapat mengurangi impact dari kebijakan ekonomi yang dikeluarkan oleh Trump, misalnya seperti proteksionisme.
Okay, the background is Indonesia has a separate central bank and a financial service authority. Now, in terms of Basel III, where supervisory and regulations are very important, what's your thought on how to integrate in terms of a macroprudential between these two institutions so that banks and financial institutions can perform independently? I think those are
There have been several ways that countries integrate, deal with micro and macroprudential regulation. Sometimes they're separate offices and sometimes they're joined together. What the U.S. did under Dodd-Frank was put the macroprudential with the monetary policy in the Fed and left the microprudential for at least small and medium-sized banks separate. So that's one choice. The UK had all regulation done separately, and then they brought it back into the Bank of England. So, there is an advantage to having macroprudential regulation done by the same people that are doing monetary policy, I think. And so possibly that would be a useful way to think about it. Whereas if you're talking about macroprudential, and what do we mean by macro and microprudential? Microprudential is the question whether a bank is healthy by itself, whether the depositors are at risk. Macroprudential is whether the bank's failure has a macroeconomic effect. And so it's a different way of doing regulation. And the macroprudential is going to be focused on the biggest banks, whereas microprudential is trying to make sure even the tiniest little banks have enough capital so that they can actually survive. So I think that's not a bad way to split. But then there's, of course, the question, what happens after split? Which side do they go?
Yeah, so that should be, I think that's what is happening also in Indonesia, that micro-prudential is in the hands of SFSA and macro-prudential in the hands of Bank Indonesia. But the split was only about 3 years ago, so they're trying to find, I think, the right balance of going forward. So that's some background for you. The third one from students, yes.
Hello, my name is Alvina Gracia Sianturi and I'm from Atma Jaya University. Good day to you, Professor Robert Triangle. And I will ask you a question. What is the basis of the mandate to attend to financial stability? Is there a sound legislative basis or a clear public understanding of the responsibility to ensure financial stability? Thank you.
So it's a relatively new idea that government should be involved in financial stability. And one of the reasons that I did my little chimpanzee pictures at the beginning was because some people think that what the government is trying to do then is to eliminate risk from the financial markets. And it's basically not what the mandate is. The mandate is really much more like the monetary policy mandate, which is we're trying to stabilize the economy. Each country is trying to stabilize its own economy, and part of that stabilization involves making sure that there isn't a financial crisis, because if there's a financial crisis, there's going to be a recession. So I think the mandate is typically the same as the mandate for economic stabilization at the macro level.
Okay, good evening, Mr. Reynolds. I will share to you about my opinion. Let's talk about the crisis 2008. Some people say that its crisis is different, so we cannot generalize its financial crisis. When commenting the 2008 crisis, some people also say nobody saw it coming. Do you have comment on this?
Basically, two statements. One is this time is different. So each crisis is different. So that's one. So you cannot really predict them. And the other one is saying that nobody saw this coming. You cannot really predict these things. So I mean, I think this is in part what you're saying, that maybe we can see about the financial crisis and the prospect of financial stability. I think that is kind of.
Yes, well, I think that is a very important question, and obviously it's a hard question to answer convincingly because we haven't had the next crisis yet that we missed. So we've done research to see whether this kind of measure would have predicted the financial crisis that we had. And it turns out that if you look a year or 2 or 5 years before the financial crisis, the same firms that got into trouble were at the top of the list. And so it's a suggestion that regulation would actually, if it had been effective, would have reduced the chances for this financial crisis. In fact, some of the banks that got into trouble in the financial crisis bought mortgage subsidiaries in 2007. So they were busily ramping up all their business in exactly the wrong time, exactly before the financial crisis. So you're right, they did not foresee that there was a crisis coming. A small number of people did foresee that the crisis was coming, and we now have movies about them. But you can see from watching the movies that it wasn't easy. So one of the reasons for doing this research is so that we do have some tools to look at future financial crises and see whether the conditions are actually right for such financial crises or not. And I think that you would find that when you look at the history of financial crises, that they all involve banks that are getting into trouble. In the Reinhard Rogoff book, this time is different. There are financial crises and non-financial crises, but I think in almost all the financial crises that the banks were in trouble. So if you can actually keep the banks from getting too excessively exposed, then I think you really reduce the risk of a financial crisis. But only the future will tell us. And if Mr. Trump is successful in deregulating the banks, maybe we'll get to do the experiment.
So thanks for all the Atma Jaya students for asking the question. Those are interesting and not easy questions to answer. Now I would like to exercise my rights to ask Professor a question. Now as I read about this financial instability, as I prepare for this event, I saw articles mentioning about the so-called Minsky moments, the financial instability hypothesis. Now, do you think we need to supplement current economic theories to take into account these things?
Well, I think that there has been kind of a revolution in macroeconomics following the financial crisis, because there were almost no macro models that had a financial sector. And so there is now a booming area in what's called macrofinance, which is trying to build financial models into macroeconomic systems. And some of these are dynamic general equilibrium models, which are complicated and simplified. Simple models, but complicated solutions. And others are more econometrically oriented. But there are steps along the way that are hard to actually build models of. Partly because we haven't got enough financial crises that we can really say, what are the systematic things that happen every time? And partly because it's not totally, so we think about a financial crisis as kind of being a supply side effect, where the financial sector gets into trouble and then they stop making loans, and that brings down the real economy. But there is certainly some demand side as well. And in the U.S., it looks like the supply of loans might have gone down, but apparently the demand for loans went down too. And what does it mean when banks don't make loans to corporations that are in trouble? Well, you might not think that you want to make loans to corporations that are in trouble. And so, is that a demand side or is that a supply side? So, in any case, there is a lot of economics going on trying to answer this kind of question. And it's a very good question.
Yeah, so students, the message is, I think you've seen me put on Professor Engel's CV, and even though he got his Nobel Prize in 2003, up until now he keeps on doing all the things that is necessary for him. So the economic theory keeps on changing, so you need to keep yourself updated and you need to keep on improving your knowledge all the time, even though one of these days you may graduate. So that's the message for you, students of Atma Jaya.
Let me just thank you for saying that, because that is actually true. That the economic environment is always changing, and it's so fascinating to keep up with it. The events that we see, like the financial crisis, for example, but like the currency, like the commodity collapse, and all, these are continually changing. And if you pay attention, you'll be stimulated to do this the rest of your life. It's really, it's exciting. It's exciting.
Okay, now for our friends in the general public, Lina, you want to ask the questions? Now, Lina is a chief economist of Bank Tabungan Negara, whose name we mentioned at the very top. So he wants to ask the questions. Please do, please do, Lina.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me. Professor Engel, I'm very interested on your table there, showing the asterisk for the Indonesian financial institution. But can you elaborate more on the meaning of positive and negative of the asterisk? You show that there are only 3 banks in Indonesia that have the positive asterisk. What does it mean? Is it a good news or bad news, especially for media? And related to that, you mentioned that there are only 3 banks in Indonesia with positive asterisk. You said that those 3 banks are overcapitalized. Does it mean that those 3 banks should increase their or should leverage more on their ratings, or have the ability to increase their ratings based on their current rating?
So the interpretation of the asterisk numbers, because those two has numbers that they have to look up, and what do they need to do for those having those 3 banks?
The 3 banks that have positive S risk.
Yes.
So if you have a positive S risk, you can reduce it by making the bank smaller. You can reduce it by reducing the leverage, and you can reduce it by lowering your beta, which you can only really do by, for example, reducing the risk of your portfolio or reducing its correlation with the market as a whole. So banks that are trying to reduce their S risk often sell assets and retire debt. So some borrowing, corporate borrowing, not just deposits. You could sell assets and retire debt, and that's going to reduce the size of your balance sheet. It doesn't change your equity position particularly, but it makes your S risk get smaller. You could also sell shares of stock, and that would increase your market cap because it produces cash, which you could think of as assets, or you could use that cash to reduce debt.
This bank, BTN, is dealing with mortgage. So for people who want to borrow for long term, that's why their assets are mostly mortgages.
See, okay, so do you sell mortgages in this country or not?
Yeah.
So one thing you could do, if there's a market for mortgages, which of course is a big market in the U.S. and is, at least the structured versions of it got people into trouble. You can securitize the mortgages and sell them as packages to pension funds and large investors, potentially foreign investors who would like exposure to the Indonesian economy. You take the revenue and you reduce your borrowing. That's a way of reducing your S risk. But let me just say that the numbers that I see for Indonesia are very low. I mean, even for those 3 banks that have a positive S risk, I'm not sure that I would push you very hard to reduce it more. I'm more concerned about the big negative S risks because, you know, I'm not sure whether the numbers seem small to you, but if you take those numbers and you compare them with what the GDP of Indonesia is, or the resources that the regulators might have to commit if you really get into trouble, basically they're small. And you'd probably get a private investor to come in and just, invest in your bank if you needed it. Furthermore, there's another issue which is not so obvious in these tables, but if there are only 1 or 2 banks that are systemically important, if they get into trouble, the rest of the competitors are usually more than happy to pick up the business. So it doesn't actually produce a crisis. It's when the other competitors are weak too that nobody is able to pick up the business. Nobody can buy these mortgages that you're trying to sell because everybody's trying to sell mortgages at the same time. And so, I think, there is a view that every bank in the U.S. wanted to be the most risky bank because if you're the first one there, you make some money and it's not a risk for the economy. But when everybody's trying to get there at the same time, it becomes a financial crisis.
There's a gentleman at the very back, the white shirt, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Robert. My name is Sindur. I'm the faculty of law here. Here in Indonesia, small markets and individual services are growing, but the gap between banks as the finance support will not reach those services as much as non-bank organizations. So, my question is, how the listing that non-bank organizations provide to the small markets and to the individual services can be the solution to this crisis condition for the future financial stability? Thank you.
I think the background to this is that the access of small to medium scale enterprise to the banking sector and the financial sector is very low right now. And there seems like a disconnect. Whereas the growth, the engine and the poverty, everything else is on the small to medium scale enterprises. And that is the disconnect that we need to answer. So just any thought on that?
Well, that is exactly what I thought the issue might be. That if the banks really are too risk averse, they're not going to be willing to lend to small enterprises and do the monitoring that needs to be done with new enterprises. So what can be done? Well, the regulators potentially could change the incentives that the banks have to make loans. They could, in fact, have probably you're doing risk weights, and if you had risk weights, you might decide to reduce them for small enterprises. I'm not actually a fan of risk weights, so that's not exactly my first choice. But I think regulators do have a role in encouraging banks to make loans rather than to just sit on their balance sheet. It's not enough just to say you have a 20% capital ratio, because that's really pretty high. So, but there are some alternatives to this procedure which I think are worth exploring. First of all, there are alternatives to formal banking which are becoming ever more important around the world. These are internet-based lending platforms which might not work for big enterprises, but for small enterprises, they really provide some possible answers. They can be international. There is the problem of how you monitor, but really some of these problems could be dealt with. There are other kinds of shadow banking that might be profitable as well. And I think that if it was easy to start a new bank, that you can get a license to start a bank. There could be neighborhood banks, sort of somewhere between microfinance and regular banking, that could be neighborhood banks, and the neighborhood would deposit their checks in this bank, and then the banks would make loans to the neighborhood. And such neighborhood banks are really quite common in the U.S. They are focused on lending to the neighborhood and the locale where they're located because they know the people, they know their clients, and it's a little bit like old-fashioned banking, and that could be done.
Yeah, I would like to ask also a couple of facts. One is that you are absolutely right in saying that Indonesia's has this quite low, and too many banks actually sitting on too much capital, and they need to do more activities on the lending side. They need to take more risk probably. So that's one. So because only 3 banks having a positive risk. The other side, the opposite. So that's one. And the other one is that when you talk about China and Korea, market rumor is many banks from China and Korea are thinking about acquiring small Indonesian banks to get a foothold and get into the Indonesian market because there is just such a big opportunity. So those are the things that I think would put some context into local context into what your research is doing right now.
It's interesting, yeah. There are a lot of things to think about in that direction.
Yeah. So we have 5 more minutes. My press colleague, please. My press colleague. Yeah. Okay. Please. Are you from the press? Yeah. Okay. 2 questions. One from gentleman at the back and one from gentleman at the front. Please.
I have a question. This is related to Indonesia. In 2013, Indonesia split the central bank into Bank of Indonesia as a central bank, and the institutions for the Financial Service Authority. So, what's your opinion? Which one is better? Using only single financial institution or split into 2 institutions of Indonesia?
I don't really know what would be the best for Indonesia, but I do think the idea that we talked about before of splitting the regulatory process between the microprudential and the macroprudential, where the macroprudential would join with monetary policy, is an important candidate. There might be reasons why it won't work in Indonesia, but I think it's an important idea.
Just to also add, because I've read some of the paper, if you take a look at the data and split between those who has 2 authorities versus 1 single authority, I think there is no correlation. Singapore has 1 million, but still this is very high. And if you look at other countries, I think it's about the same. So I think if we do a correlation and things like that, maybe I think we we will have a better models. So it depends on the local context, just like as you mentioned before. So final question, yeah, gentleman at the front.
Thank you, Professor Engel. Thank you, sir. My name is Bernard. I'm from Faculty of Economics, University of Indonesia. I have two short questions for you. If you don't mind, would you like to share your view on what we call fintech or financial technology? There is now rising in the financial industry using what they call disruptive technology. Will that fintech cause another financial crisis in the future? Or will that only change the way banking system operates? And second question is, how will that fintech contribute to financial stability? Thank you, sir.
Okay. There is this surging of financial technology. Yes, and I think he asked two questions. One is the second one would be, will it create a financial instability in the future? I think the first one would be the effect of the financial technology.
So there's a lot of interest in financial technology and fintech in the U.S. And there are a couple of different strands of it. One strand is sort of the blockchain technology, which is supposedly going to streamline our accounting and so forth. I'm not an expert on that, and I think I better not comment on it because I'm sort of skeptical, but without knowing enough to be articulate about my skepticism. Another is sort of robo-investing. In other words, investments that are done by computer rather than by talking to your analyst. And my view is that that's not really going to make very much difference. We have lots of passive investing, and I think it's going to be just another flavor of passive investment, not based on indices, but based on somebody's computer program that does this sort of thing. So I don't think that's likely to lead to instability. I'm actually more concerned, and I don't think we usually call this fintech, I'm more concerned about high-frequency trading that really changes the way markets work and takes slight changes in the trading rules and amplifies their effects. So that what I think we see is that high-frequency trading has made the markets very liquid most of the time. Every now and then they blow up. So the trade-off is between good liquidity all the time and periodic explosions. And I don't know whether we can solve the explosion part. I've actually made some proposals, and there are some other proposals out there to deal with it, but at least so far, the regulatory apparatus hasn't made the tweaks that I think might reduce the instability of high-frequency trading. And but I hear the Trump administration wants to rethink Reagan, and that maybe they will be able to figure out what to do about it. But there are a lot of resources spent on speed and equals and all this sort of thing, and it's kind of a zero-sum game in this case, it seems to me. And so I think, we're not being efficient in this. Now, we used to have specialists, and they made a lot of money without taking much risk. So maybe it's not
high-frequency traders make a fair amount of money and don't take much risk, but maybe we can do better.
Well, thank you, Professor. I think left alone, I think if time is unlimited, I think half of the room would leave, but the rest of the room will bug you for the rest of the night. So, but I think we have to put a stop to this. You have a busy schedule ahead. So I'm going to give this back to Amanda. Amanda.
Thank you, Professor Engel, for his This is indeed a memorable moment, and we would like to give a token of appreciation to our distinguished speaker, so we kindly ask you to stay on stage. And to accompany this proceeding, STEM, the traditional dance group of Atma Jaya, will perform the Lenso dance from Florence. Florence is an island in the eastern part of Indonesia, where one of the Atma Jaya founding fathers, Mr. is originally from. We would like to invite Mr. Mirza Aditya. And Mr. Nobel of the International Peace Foundation. We would also like to invite our rector, our university rector, Bapak Agus Prasetyo, and Bapak Aswi. We'd also like to invite representative of the Atma Jaya Foundation to give our moderator and our distinguished speaker. For participating. Token of appreciation will be given by the University Rector for our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Robert Fry. Ya, bagi rekan media untuk silakan mendokumentasikan prosesi ini. Dipersilakan untuk maju ke depan ruang. For those of you who would like to take pictures of these proceedings, you may come to the front of the room and please do so. The next token of appreciation is for Mr. of the International Peace Foundation as a main sponsor and promoter and made today's public lecture possible. It's given by the foundation. The next is for our moderator for today will also be given. Let's give a little time for a photo opportunity. Let's give it another round of applause for the successful public lecture today that we have been waiting and arranging for us. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of today's public lecture session by Professor Robert Fry Engel. We would like to say